The sound that woke me that morning wasn't my alarm or the usual birdsong filtering through our bedroom window. It was the persistent scraping of claws against earth, a rhythmic digging that had become the soundtrack to our lives over the past 3 weeks. I rolled over to find Daniel's side of the bed already empty, the sheets cool to the touch. Through the window, I could see him standing in our backyard, arms crossed, watching Max tear into the same patch of ground he'd been obsessing over since we'd moved into this house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had no idea that within 48 hours, yellow police tape would encircle our entire property, and Detective Raymond Pierce would be sitting in our kitchen asking questions I never imagined I'd need to answer. I didn't know that the life Daniel and I had carefully built in Pinehurst would be turned inside out, or that our loyal German Shepherd mix had uncovered something that would connect us to a mystery decades in the making. All I knew in that moment was that Max wouldn't stop digging, and the hole beneath the old oak tree was getting deeper every single day. The morning I'm thinking of was a Tuesday in late September, one of those Pacific Northwest days where mist clings to everything like a second skin. Daniel and I had been in the Willowbrook Lane house for exactly 23 days, and I was still tripping over unpacked boxes in the hallway. The move from Seattle had been Daniel's idea, a chance to escape the suffocating pace of city life and plant roots somewhere quieter. I'd been hesitant at first. My graphic design business was thriving in Seattle, and I worried that relocating to a town of barely 8,000 people would strangle my career before it truly began. But Daniel had been persuasive. He'd found a position teaching history at Pinehurst High School, and the salary combined with the lower cost of living meant we could actually afford a house with a yard. A real yard, not the cramped patio of our Seattle apartment where Max could barely turn around. The photos of the property had sold me despite my reservations. A charming 1950s colonial with original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and nearly half an acre of land bordered by towering Douglas firs. The price had seemed almost too good, but our real estate agent Philip Crane had assured us the owners were motivated sellers who'd already relocated out of state. We'd signed the papers without ever meeting Richard Lawson, the previous owner. Everything had been handled through attorneys and electronic signatures. Philip had mentioned something about Lawson wanting a quick, clean sale, no complications. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. People sold houses for all sorts of reasons. Job transfers, divorce, financial troubles. It wasn't my business to pry into the personal circumstances of strangers. The house had been empty for nearly 6 months before we bought it, and it showed. The yard was overgrown with blackberry brambles, the gutters clogged with pine needles, and the interior smelled of mildew and neglect. But underneath the superficial damage, the bones were solid. Daniel and I had spent our first 2 weeks scrubbing, painting, and slowly transforming the space into something that felt like ours. Max had adjusted immediately, thrilled to have room to run and explore after years of apartment living. Then the digging started. At first, I thought it was normal dog behavior. Max was 5 years old, a rescue we'd adopted 3 years earlier, and while he'd always been well behaved, he'd never had access to this much dirt before. I figured he was just excited, working out excess energy, maybe chasing the scent of a mole or gopher. Daniel agreed. We laughed about it over dinner, joking that we'd have to teach our city dog some country manners. But Max wasn't digging randomly across the yard. He returned to the same spot every single time we let him outside. A specific area about 15 feet from the back fence, directly beneath the largest oak tree on the property. The tree itself was magnificent, easily 100 years old, its branches spreading like protective arms over that corner of the yard. The ground beneath it was shaded and slightly raised, as if the earth had settled unevenly over the decades. By the end of the first week, Max had excavated a hole roughly 2 feet deep and 3 feet across. I'd filled it in twice, thinking that would discourage him, but he'd simply dug it out again with even more determination. His paws were constantly dirty, his nails worn down from the constant scraping against packed earth and tree roots. When I tried to keep him inside, he would sit by the back door and whine, a low, persistent sound that set my nerves on edge. Daniel thought I was overreacting. "It's just a dog being a dog, Victoria," he'd said when I suggested we might need to call a veterinarian or animal behaviorist. He's not hurting anything. Let him dig. We can reseed the grass in the spring. But there was something about Max's single-minded focus that unsettled me. I'd owned dogs my entire childhood, and I'd never seen behavior quite like this. Max wasn't playing. He wasn't burying toys or bones. He was excavating with the intensity of purpose, as if he knew something was down there and was determined to reach it. His normally calm demeanor had shifted. He barely touched his food, sleeping fitfully at night, always alert and listening. Several times I'd woken in the darkness to find him standing at the bedroom window, staring out at the backyard, a low growl rumbling in his chest. On the morning of day 23, I made coffee and joined Daniel in the yard. The September air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Max had already been at it for what must have been an hour, judging by the fresh pile of dirt beside the hole. The excavation had grown significantly deeper overnight. I could no longer see the bottom from where I stood. "This is getting out of hand," I said, wrapping both hands around my coffee mug for warmth. Daniel glanced at me, then back at Max, who had momentarily paused his digging to look up at us with intense, intelligent eyes. "I know," Daniel admitted, and I heard the first crack of concern in his voice. "I've never seen him like this. Maybe we should have someone look at the yard. Could be something dead down there. An animal carcass or something that's drawing him." The thought made my stomach turn, but it was plausible. The property had been vacant for months. Any number of creatures could have died and been buried by falling leaves and soil. I pulled out my phone and searched for local pest control services, making a mental note to call as soon as they opened. But before I could dial, Max's digging intensified. He was going at the earth with frantic energy now, dirt flying behind him in rooster tails. Then he stopped abruptly, backed up, and began barking. Not his usual bark, but something deeper, more urgent. No witnesses. No body. She had simply vanished. And someone had kept a box full of surveillance photos of her buried in our backyard. Daniel had already pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed. "Yes, I need to report something," he said when the dispatcher answered. "We found something on our property. Something that might be connected to a missing person case." I barely heard the rest of the conversation. I was staring at the photographs spread across our kitchen table, at Heather Monroe's unsuspecting smile captured by someone who had been watching her, studying her, documenting her movements in the weeks or months before she vanished. My eyes drifted to the remaining bundles still in the box, and I felt my stomach drop. There was more. Whatever else was wrapped in that plastic sheeting, we hadn't uncovered it all yet. And somehow, I knew that whatever else we found was going to be worse than surveillance photos and newspaper clippings. Max had been right to dig. He'd known something was wrong with this place, with this ground beneath the oak tree. And now that we'd unearthed the box and its terrible contents, there would be no going back to the simple life Daniel and I had imagined when we'd signed the papers on this house. The police were coming. Our property was about to become a crime scene. And somewhere, buried even deeper than Max had managed to dig, I suspected there were answers to questions that had haunted this town for nearly 3 decades. The police arrived within 20 minutes of Daniel's call. I watched from the kitchen window as 2 patrol cars turned onto Willowbrook Lane, their lights flashing but sirens mercifully silent. Our neighbors were already starting to notice. Carol Bennett from 3 houses down stood on her front porch, hands shading her eyes as she watched the vehicles pull into our driveway. Catherine Blake, who lived directly next door and had brought us a casserole our first week in the house, emerged from her front door with a concerned expression. Officer Linda Grant was the first through our door. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes that immediately cataloged everything in our kitchen. Behind her came an older officer whose nameplate read Morrison. Daniel had set the box on the counter and stepped back from it, as if proximity to its contents might somehow contaminate him. I understood the impulse. Even from across the room, I could feel the wrongness radiating from those photographs and clippings. Officer Grant pulled on a pair of latex gloves before approaching the table. Her partner did the same. Neither of them spoke as they examined what we'd laid out. Grant picked up one of the photographs, holding it carefully by the edges, her jaw tightening as she studied the image. She set it down and reached for a newspaper clipping, scanning the headline quickly before looking up at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. Her voice was calm, professional, giving nothing away. 3 weeks, Daniel answered. "We bought the house from Richard Lawson. The sale was handled remotely. We never actually met him." "And your dog found this," Morrison interjected, glancing toward Max, who sat alert in the corner of the kitchen, still watching the box with unwavering focus. "He's been digging in that spot for weeks," I explained. "We thought maybe there was a dead animal or something underground. We never expected to find something like this." Grant was already on her radio, speaking in low tones with someone at the station. I caught fragments of her conversation. "Detective Pierce, cold case, possible evidence, need forensics." She ended the call and turned back to us with measured care. "I need you both to step outside with Officer Morrison. Don't touch anything else in this room." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Detective Pierce is on his way, and he'll want to speak with you both. "Is this about Heather Monroe?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "The missing woman from the articles." Grant's expression shifted slightly, acknowledgement without confirmation. "Let's wait for the detective before we get into specifics. But yes, this appears to be related to an open investigation." "Open," Daniel repeated. "But those articles are from 1997. That's almost 30 years ago." "Missing persons cases don't close," Grant said quietly. "Not until we have answers." We followed Morrison outside into the cool morning air. More neighbors had gathered now, drawn by the police presence like moths to flame. Catherine approached the edge of our property line, worry creasing her face. "Is everything all right?" she called out. "Victoria, Daniel, what's happening?" "We're fine," Daniel called back, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just something we found in the yard. The police are handling it." Morrison positioned himself between us and the growing cluster of onlookers, a physical barrier that made it clear questions would not be entertained. I hugged myself against the chill, watching as more vehicles arrived. An unmarked sedan pulled up, and a man in his 50s emerged. He was tall, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen things that changed a person. He moved with deliberate purpose toward Officer Grant, who met him at our front door. "That's Detective Raymond Pierce," Morrison said, following my gaze. "He's been with the department for 30 years. He was a rookie when Heather Monroe disappeared." The words landed with unexpected weight. Pierce had lived with this case for 3 decades. It had been part of his career, possibly a driving force throughout his years in law enforcement. And now, through some twist of fate and a persistent dog, we'd stumbled into the middle of it. Pierce disappeared into our house for several minutes. When he emerged, his expression was carefully neutral, but I caught something in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or vindication. He approached us with measured steps, pulling a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "I understand you've had quite a morning. I need to ask you both some questions, and then I'll need to secure your property while our forensics team processes the scene. This is going to take some time, possibly days. Do you have somewhere else you can stay while we work?" "Days," I echoed, the reality of the situation finally penetrating the fog of shock I'd been operating in. "You're taking over our house." "Not the house itself," Pierce clarified. "But the yard, yes. That hole your dog dug could be a significant crime scene. We need to excavate properly, bring in ground-penetrating radar, search for additional evidence." He paused, studying us both carefully. "What you found in that box, it's the first real lead we've had in the Heather Monroe case since 1997. I know this is an inconvenience for you, but I'm asking for your cooperation and patience while we do our jobs." Daniel reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you need. We want to help." Pierce nodded, his expression softening slightly. Good. Now, let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything about how you came to buy this house. We spent the next hour recounting details that had seemed mundane at the time but now felt laden with significance. The online listing. Philip Crane's eagerness to close the deal quickly. The absent seller who'd handled everything through attorneys. Richard Lawson's name came up repeatedly, and each time Pierce's pen moved across his notebook with increased vigor. How much do you know about Lawson? Pierce asked. Did your real estate agent provide any background? Just that he'd owned the property for about 15 years, Daniel said. He'd moved out of state for work. Philip said he was motivated to sell because he didn't want to deal with maintaining a property remotely. Did Crane mention where Lawson moved to? Pierce pressed. Daniel and I exchanged glances. We couldn't remember if that detail had ever been shared. I don't think so, I admitted. Is that important? Everything is important at this stage, Pierce replied. His expression remained neutral, but I sensed Will's turning behind those calculating eyes. I'll need contact information for Philip Crane. We'll want to speak with him directly. By early afternoon, our property had transformed into something from a television crime drama. Yellow tape cordoned off the entire backyard. White tents had been erected around the excavation site. Men and women in forensics gear moved with careful precision, documenting everything, taking photographs, sifting through soil with meticulous attention. A mobile command unit had been set up in our driveway, and the steady hum of a portable generator filled the air. Catherine had insisted we come to her house while the investigation proceeded. She'd made tea and set out cookies, fussing over us with the kind of maternal concern that made my throat tight. Her husband George had taken Max for a walk, giving the investigators space to work and offering our agitated dog some relief from the chaos. I still can't believe this, Catherine said, setting down her teacup with a slight rattle. That poor girl. I remember when she disappeared. The whole town was searching for weeks. We put up posters, organized volunteer search parties. Her parents never gave up hope, even after the police stopped actively investigating. Did you know her? I asked, latching onto this connection to the past. Catherine shook her head. Not personally. She was younger than me, and I didn't work at the hospital. But Pinehurst is small. Everyone knew about it when she vanished. Her mother used to stand at the town square every anniversary, holding a vigil, asking if anyone had information. She did that for 20 years before she passed away. Heather's father moved to California shortly after. He couldn't stand staying in the town where he'd lost his daughter. The weight of that grief pressed down on me. 20 years of vigils. A mother who'd died without answers. A father who'd been driven from his home by the ghost of his missing child. And somehow, evidence of what happened to Heather Monroe had been buried in our backyard all along. Detective Pierce came to Catherine's house just after 4 in the afternoon. His expression was grim, and he carried himself with the heaviness of someone bearing difficult news. He accepted Catherine's offer of coffee but remained standing, as if sitting would somehow make what he had to say more difficult. We found additional evidence, he began, directing his words to Daniel and me. The box contained more than photographs and newspaper clippings. There were personal items. A necklace that matches the description of jewelry Heather was wearing the night she disappeared. A hospital ID badge. Other items I'm not at liberty to discuss in detail. My stomach dropped. Personal items meant trophies. Whoever had buried that box had kept pieces of Heather Monroe, tangible reminders of whatever had happened to her. Pierce continued, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. We've also begun a more extensive excavation of the area. Ground-penetrating radar has identified some anomalies deeper in the soil. We're bringing in additional equipment and specialists. He paused, meeting my eyes directly. I need you to understand that what we might find in your yard could be difficult. We're treating this as a potential recovery site now. Recovery site. The euphemism wasn't lost on me. They thought Heather Monroe might be buried beneath that oak tree. That Max hadn't just found evidence of a crime. He'd found a grave. Daniel's hand found mine again, his grip almost painfully tight. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long will this take?" "At least a week, possibly longer," Pierce replied. "We have to be thorough. Every layer of soil needs to be documented, every piece of potential evidence logged and preserved. This case has been cold for 30 years. We can't afford to miss anything now." "What about Richard Lawson?" I asked, voicing the question that had been circling my mind since we'd opened that box. "He owned this house when Heather disappeared. Is he a suspect?" Pierce's expression remained carefully controlled, but I saw the flicker of something behind his eyes. "Richard Lawson is a person of interest in this investigation," he said carefully. "We're working to locate him now. That's all I can say at this time." A person of interest. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. We'd bought a house from a man who might have killed someone and buried evidence of his crime in the backyard. The thought made me feel physically ill. Had we handed him money, signed papers, thanked him through our attorneys for the sale while he'd been sitting somewhere knowing what lay beneath that oak tree? "There's something else," Pierce added, his tone shifting slightly. "We're going to need to interview your neighbors, anyone who might have known Lawson or have memories of the property from that time period. Small towns have long memories. Someone might know something they didn't realize was important." Catherine straightened in her chair. "I've lived on this street for 35 years, she said firmly. "I'll tell you whatever I can remember." Pierce nodded gratefully. "We'll be taking formal statements from everyone on the block over the next few days. But if you remember anything now, anything at all about Richard Lawson or unusual activity at that property around 1997, it could be helpful." Catherine's brow furrowed in concentration. "Lawson bought the house in 2009 or 2010, I think. Before him, it was owned by an older couple, the Harrisons. They'd lived there since the 70s. She paused, her eyes going distant with recollection. "But wait. There was a tenant for a while. This was back in the 90s. The Harrisons had moved to a retirement community but kept the house as a rental for a few years before they sold it. There was a young man who lived there. Quiet. Kept to himself." Pierce's entire demeanor shifted, his focus laser sharp. "Do you remember his name?" Catherine shook her head slowly. "It was so long ago. But I remember thinking it was odd because he worked at the hospital. Maintenance or something like that. He was always coming and going at strange hours." The hospital. Where Heather Monroe had worked as a nurse. The connection was too significant to be coincidence. Pierce was already pulling out his phone, texting rapidly. "This is very helpful, Mrs. Blake," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow and go through some photo arrays, see if you can identify this tenant." After Pierce left, promising to keep us updated as the investigation progressed, I sat in Catherine's living room feeling unmoored from reality. 24 hours ago, my biggest concern had been unpacking boxes and getting my home office set up for client calls. Now our property was a crime scene, we were potentially connected to a 30-year-old murder, and I had no idea when we'd be able to return to any semblance of normal life. George returned with Max as evening approached. The dog seemed calmer now, as if his purpose had been fulfilled. He'd found what he was meant to find, and now the humans were handling the rest. He came directly to me, pressing his solid warmth against my legs, and I buried my fingers in his fur, grateful for something real and uncomplicated to hold on to. "We'll stay in a hotel," Daniel decided as we gathered our things. Catherine had offered her guest room, but I could see the exhaustion in Daniel's face, the need for privacy to process everything that had happened. "We need space to think, to figure out what happens next." The Pinehurst Inn was a small establishment near the center of town, the kind of place that catered to visiting relatives and the occasional tourist drawn by the area's natural beauty. The proprietor, an efficient woman named Grace Porter, checked us in without asking questions, though I could see curiosity burning in her eyes. News traveled fast in small towns. She probably already knew why we needed a room. Our accommodations were simple but clean. A queen bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a television that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. Max settled immediately on the rug beside the bed, his body finally relaxing after weeks of tension. Daniel and I sat at the table, Chinese takeout containers between us, neither of us eating much. "Do you think he's still alive?" I asked quietly. "Richard Lawson. Do you think he's out there somewhere, knowing what we found?" Daniel stared at his untouched food. "I don't know. Part of me hopes he is, that he has to face what he did. But another part of me hopes he's dead, that he can't hurt anyone else." The thought hadn't occurred to me until that moment. If Lawson had killed once, if he'd gotten away with it for 30 years, who was to say Heather Monroe had been his only victim? How many other boxes might be buried in places we didn't know about? How many other families were still waiting for answers? My phone buzzed with a text from my mother in Portland. She'd seen something on the news, a brief mention of police activity in Pinehurst related to a cold case. She wanted to know if we were safe, if we needed anything. I typed out a quick reassurance, not ready to explain the full scope of what was happening. That conversation would require more energy than I had left. Daniel's phone rang just after 9. He answered, listened for a moment, then put it on speaker so I could hear. It was Detective Pierce. "I wanted to update you before you saw it on the news," Pierce said without preamble. "We've made progress with the excavation. We've found remains. Human remains. We'll need dental records to confirm identity, but based on the location and context, we believe we've found Heather Monroe." The words seemed to echo in the small hotel room. Found her. After 30 years of searching, of hoping, of not knowing, Heather Monroe had been beneath that oak tree all along. Buried in the yard of a house that had changed hands, been rented and sold and lived in by people who had no idea they were walking over a grave. "There's more," Pierce continued, his voice heavy. "The remains show signs of trauma. This was definitely a homicide. We've also recovered additional evidence from the grave site that we believe will help us build a case against Richard Lawson. We're pursuing multiple leads on his whereabouts." "Thank you for telling us," Daniel managed, his voice rough. "What happens now?" "The forensics team will continue processing the scene for at least another week. I'll need you both to come to the station tomorrow to give formal statements. And I'd advise you to prepare yourselves for media attention. This case was high profile when it happened, and now that we've found Heather, it's going to become news again. National news, possibly." After Pierce hung up, Daniel and I sat in silence. The weight of what we'd stumbled into pressed down on us from all sides. A young woman who'd been stolen from her life, buried like trash in a backyard. A family that had spent decades searching for answers. A killer who'd walked free all this time, possibly living a normal life somewhere under the assumption he'd never be caught. "I thought moving to Pinehurst would be a fresh start," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "A chance to build something peaceful." Daniel reached across the table, taking my hand in both of his. "Maybe it still is," he said, though neither of us really believed it. "Maybe this is what we were meant to find. Maybe Max knew somehow, and we were the ones who could finally bring Heather home." It was a comforting thought, the idea that there was purpose in this nightmare. But as I lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed that night, listening to Max's steady breathing and Daniel's restless movements beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that finding the box had been only the beginning. Whatever happened next, whatever truths emerged from our yard and the investigation that was consuming our lives, would change everything about the peaceful future we'd imagined in Pinehurst. The media descended on Pinehurst like a swarm within 24 hours of the discovery. By Wednesday morning, news vans lined the streets surrounding Willowbrook Lane, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sun. Reporters stood on corners doing live shots, the familiar backdrop of our yellow-taped property visible behind them as they recounted the tragic story of Heather Monroe and the decades-long mystery that had finally found resolution. Daniel and I watched from our hotel room as the story spread across local channels, then regional news, and finally onto national networks. Heather's face, forever young in the photographs her family had provided to media over the years, appeared on screen after screen. The narrative was irresistible to journalists. A missing nurse, a cold case spanning 3 decades, a couple who'd innocently moved into a house only to have their dog uncover a burial site. By Thursday, we'd received interview requests from every major news outlet in the country. Detective Pierce had advised us not to speak to media until after we'd given our formal statements. We spent Thursday morning at the Cedar Valley Police Department, sitting in separate rooms as investigators walked us through every detail of the past 3 weeks. They wanted to know about the purchase process, our interactions with Philip Crane, any communications we'd had regarding Richard Lawson. They asked about Max's behavior, about the moment we'd opened the box, about every photograph and newspaper clipping we'd seen before calling the police. My interviewer was a detective named Sandra Mills, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made the interrogation feel less invasive than it might have otherwise. She took careful notes as I spoke, occasionally asking follow-up questions that revealed how thoroughly they were examining every angle of the case. "Had you done any research on the property before purchasing?" Mills asked at one point. "Looked into its history, previous owners, anything unusual about the sale?" I shook my head. "We did a home inspection and a title search, like you do with any property purchase. Nothing came up as problematic. The title was clear, no liens, no legal issues." Philip assured us it was a straightforward transaction. "And you never had any direct contact with Richard Lawson?" "Never. Everything went through attorneys and electronic signatures." I remember thinking it was very modern and efficient at the time. Now I understand it was probably intentional. He didn't want to meet us face to face. Mills nodded slowly, her pen moving across the page. "We're building a timeline of Lawson's movements and activities. The more we learn about him, the clearer the picture becomes. He was careful, methodical. But even careful people make mistakes eventually." After my statement was complete, I met Daniel in the waiting area. He looked exhausted, his normally neat appearance rumpled and worn. We'd been at the station for nearly 4 hours, and I could see the toll the stress was taking on him. His position at Pinehurst High School was supposed to start in 2 weeks, but now he was fielding calls from concerned administrators who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to understand the situation. "They're not questioning my employment," Daniel assured me as we drove back to the hotel. "But they're worried about the attention this is bringing to the town. The school board wants to meet with me before classes start, just to discuss how we're handling everything." "How we're handling everything," I repeated, unable to keep the bitter edge from my voice. "As if we have any control over this situation. We bought a house. Our dog dug a hole. We did the right thing by calling the police. None of this is our fault, but somehow it feels like we're being punished for it." Daniel reached over and squeezed my knee. "I know. But we'll get through this. Once the investigation concludes and the media moves on to the next story, things will settle down. We just have to be patient." His optimism felt forced, but I appreciated the effort. The truth was that neither of us knew what our lives would look like once this was over. Would we stay in Pinehurst, in a house that would forever be associated with murder and tragedy? Would we be able to walk into that backyard without thinking about what had been buried beneath the oak tree? Could we build any kind of normal life in the shadow of Heather Monroe's death? Friday brought a development that shifted the investigation into new territory. Detective Pierce called us in the early afternoon, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately set my nerves on edge. "We need you to come back to the station. We've located Richard Lawson, and there are some things you need to know before this becomes public information." The drive to Cedar Valley Police Department felt longer than it should have, every mile stretching out as my imagination conjured scenarios. Had they arrested him? Was he claiming some connection to us, trying to deflect blame? Had he confessed? The possibilities spiraled through my mind until we pulled into the parking lot and I forced myself to take steadying breaths. Pierce met us at the entrance, his expression grave. He led us not to an interrogation room but to a small conference room where several other people were already assembled. I recognized Officer Grant and Detective Mills. The others were unfamiliar, though their badges and serious demeanors marked them as law enforcement. "Please sit," Pierce said, gesturing to empty chairs at the conference table. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be released to the media within the next few hours, but I wanted you to hear it from us first. Daniel and I sat, and I felt his hand find mine under the table, our fingers interlacing tightly. Pierce remained standing, his hands resting on the back of a chair as he spoke. We located Richard Lawson yesterday evening. He's been living in northern Idaho under his own name, working as an accountant for a small firm in Cordon Lane. When local authorities approached him this morning, he agreed to speak with them voluntarily. He waived his right to an attorney, which surprised everyone involved. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. What did he say? Pierce's expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. Regret, maybe, or frustration. He confessed. Admitted to killing Heather Monroe in August of 1997. He provided details that only the killer would know, information we never released to the public. He also told us where to find additional evidence that we've since recovered and confirmed. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thin. A confession. After 30 years, the man responsible for Heather Monroe's death had simply admitted to it. There should have been relief in that knowledge, satisfaction that justice was finally within reach. Instead, I felt only a hollow sense of shock. But there's a complication, Pierce continued, and now his frustration was clear in his voice. Richard Lawson has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed 6 months ago and given less than a year to live. According to his doctors, he has perhaps 3 or 4 months remaining. He claims that's why he confessed. He wants to clear his conscience before he dies. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Lawson was dying. Any trial would be truncated, any prison sentence meaningless. He would face justice in the most technical sense, but he would escape any real consequences for what he'd done. Death was coming for him regardless of the legal system's intervention. Heather Monroe's family, Daniel said quietly. Do they know? Her father has been notified, Pierce confirmed. He's flying in from California this weekend. We'll be arranging for him to meet with prosecutors and get a full briefing on the case. He paused, his gaze moving between Daniel and me. There's something else. Lawson asked to speak with you both. The request was so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't process it. He wants to talk to us, I repeated. Why? He says he wants to apologize. To explain why he buried the evidence on the property before selling it to you. He claims he never intended for you to find it, that he thought it would remain hidden indefinitely. Absolutely not, Daniel said immediately, his voice hard. We don't owe him anything, and I have no interest in hearing his excuses. I understand that reaction, Pierce said. And you're under no obligation to meet with him. But I wanted to present the option in case you felt differently. Sometimes victims, or those affected by crimes, find closure in confronting the perpetrator. That's a personal choice only you can make. I looked at Daniel, saw the rigid set of his jaw and the anger burning in his eyes. He was right. We didn't owe Richard Lawson anything. But part of me, the part that had spent days wondering about the man who'd sold us a house with a grave in the backyard, wanted answers to questions I couldn't quite articulate. Can I think about it? I asked. I don't know what I want right now. Pierce nodded. Take whatever time you need. Lawson isn't going anywhere. He's being held at the hospital in Cordon Lane under guard. If you decide you want to speak with him, we can arrange it. If not, that's equally valid. The weekend passed in a blur of activity that felt simultaneously overwhelming and insufficient. Heather Monroe's father, Robert Monroe, arrived on Saturday. The local news covered his arrival at the police station, cameras capturing the image of a man in his 70s, bent with grief but determined in his purpose. He released a brief statement thanking the police for their dedication, thanking Daniel and me for calling authorities when we found the box, and expressing his intention to finally lay his daughter to rest with the dignity she deserved. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday, pending the release of Heather's remains from the medical examiner. Pierce told us we were welcome to attend if we wished, though again he emphasized that the choice was ours to make. The whole town would likely be there, he warned. The media attention would be intense. But Robert Monroe had specifically mentioned wanting to meet us, to thank us in person for the role we'd played in bringing his daughter home. I wrestled with the decision all week. Daniel had made peace with not attending, arguing that our presence might overshadow what should be a private moment of mourning for Heather's family and friends. But something in me felt pulled toward going, toward bearing witness to the conclusion of a tragedy we become entangled in through no choice of our own. By Tuesday, the forensics team had completed their work on our property. The yellow tape came down, the tents were dismantled, and the equipment was loaded into trucks and driven away. What remained was a backyard that looked like a battlefield. The area beneath the oak tree had been completely excavated, a gaping wound in the earth that would require professional landscaping to repair. The grass was trampled and dead from foot traffic and equipment. Our garden beds, which we'd never gotten around to planting, were crushed and unusable. We returned to the house that evening, both of us hesitant to cross the threshold as if the building itself had been fundamentally altered by what had occurred. Max had no such reservations. He trotted inside confidently, immediately beginning his usual routine of checking every room as if to confirm that everything remained where it should be. His lack of concern was oddly comforting. The house felt different despite being physically unchanged. The knowledge of what had been buried in our yard colored every corner with a darkness that hadn't been there before. I stood in the kitchen where we'd opened the box, remembering the moment when our lives had tilted into something unrecognizable, and wondered if we would ever be able to reclaim the sense of home we'd briefly felt here. Daniel came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. "We can sell," he said quietly, voicing what we'd both been thinking but hadn't dared say aloud. Start over somewhere else. No one would blame us. The offer was tempting. Walk away from Pinehurst, from this house, from the constant reminders of tragedy. Find another small town, another fresh start, another chance at the peaceful life we'd imagined. But something in me resisted that impulse. Running away felt like letting Richard Lawson claim one more victim, allowing his actions to dictate the course of our lives even from his hospital bed in Idaho. "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "This is our home. We chose it. We bought it. We're not letting what someone else did decades ago drive us away. We'll fix the yard, we'll live our lives, and we'll honor Heather's memory by building something good here." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then tightened his arms around me. "Okay," he said simply. "Then that's what we'll do." Wednesday brought an unexpected visitor. Catherine appeared at our door mid-morning with a basket of fresh muffins and an apologetic expression. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said when I invited her in. "I just wanted to check on you both. The neighborhood has been talking, and I wanted you to hear some things from me directly rather than through the rumor mill." We sat in the living room, Max immediately positioning himself at Catherine's feet for attention. She scratched his ears absently while gathering her thoughts, and I realized she was nervous about whatever she'd come to say. "There's been talk," she began slowly, "about the house. About whether it should have some kind of marker or memorial for Heather. Some of the neighbors think it would be appropriate, given what happened here. Others are concerned about property values and attracting more attention to the area." She looked at me directly. "I wanted you to know that whatever you decide about that, George and I support you. This is your home, and you shouldn't have to turn it into a public memorial if you don't want to." The suggestion hadn't occurred to me, but now that Catherine had raised it, I could see the logic. Heather Monroe had spent 3 decades in our yard. Some acknowledgement of that fact might be appropriate. But the thought of our home becoming a destination for curiosity seekers and true crime enthusiasts made my stomach turn. "I'll think about it," I told Catherine honestly. "Maybe something small and tasteful. A tree or a bench with a plaque. Something that honors Heather without turning our property into a spectacle." Catherine nodded approvingly. "That sounds like a good compromise." She hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking a lot about the tenant I mentioned to Detective Pierce. The one who lived here in the 90s. I went down to the station yesterday and looked through photo arrays, trying to identify him." She paused, her expression troubled. "I picked someone out, but Pierce wouldn't tell me if I was right. He just thanked me for my time and said they were following up on multiple leads." "The tenant." Catherine's memory had provided investigators with a potential connection between Richard Lawson and the property during the time of Heather's disappearance. But Pierce had been tight-lipped about the details, revealing only what was necessary and protecting the integrity of the investigation. "Do you think Lawson was the tenant?" I asked, voicing the question that had been circling my mind since Catherine first mentioned it. She shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. I never got a good look at the man who rented the house back then. He was private, rarely engaged with neighbors. But the timing would make sense, wouldn't it? If he was living here when Heather disappeared, if he killed her and buried her in the yard, then came back years later and bought the property to ensure no one would ever disturb the grave. The scenario was chillingly plausible. Lawson could have rented the house, committed murder, buried the evidence, then moved away and waited. Years later, when the property came up for sale, he'd purchased it to maintain control over the burial site. He'd lived here for over a decade, walking over Heather's grave daily, secure in the knowledge that his secret was safe beneath his own property. Only his cancer diagnosis had disrupted that security, forcing him to sell and leave the evidence behind. By Thursday, I'd made my decision about Richard Lawson's request to meet. Daniel still refused, but he didn't try to talk me out of going. "I think you need this," he said simply when I told him. "Whatever answers you're looking for, maybe he can provide them. Just promise me you'll be careful. Don't let him manipulate you or make you feel responsible for his choices." Detective Pierce arranged the meeting for Friday morning. He would accompany me to Cordon Lane, a 4-hour drive north. The meeting would take place at the hospital where Lawson was being treated, under guard and with limited time. Pierce warned me that Lawson looked frail, that the cancer had ravaged his body, and that I should prepare myself for the visual reality of a dying man. We left Pinehurst before dawn, the landscape gradually shifting from the familiar pine forests of home to the more rugged terrain of northern Idaho. Pierce drove in comfortable silence, occasionally making small talk about the investigation but respecting my need for quiet as I mentally prepared for the confrontation ahead. The hospital was a modern facility on the outskirts of Cordon Lane. Pierce checked us in at the security desk, and we were escorted to a private room on the 3rd floor where a uniformed officer stood guard outside the door. He nodded at Pierce, then opened the door to allow us entry. Richard Lawson sat propped up in the hospital bed, and Catherine's warning hadn't prepared me for the reality of his appearance. He was skeletal, his skin stretched tight over his bones and tinged with the yellow cast of jaundice. His eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, tracked my movement as I entered the room. An 4-line ran into his arm, and the steady beep of monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to the heavy silence. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I stood near the door, unwilling to move closer, with Pierce positioned slightly behind me as both witness and protection. "I didn't come for you," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I came for me. I need to understand why you did what you did. Why you buried that box in my yard and left it for someone else to find." Lawson's laugh was bitter and cut short by a coughing fit that left him gasping. When he'd recovered, he met my eyes with something that might have been remorse or might have been resignation. "I never intended for anyone to find it," he said. "I thought I'd die in that house, that the secret would die with me. But then the cancer came, and I knew I couldn't maintain the property anymore. I had to sell." "So you just left it there," I pressed. "Buried evidence of murder for the next owners to stumble across. Did you think about that? About what it would do to whoever bought your house?" "Every day," he admitted. "But I'm a coward, Mrs. Hayes. I always have been. I couldn't bring myself to move the box, to risk disturbing the grave. And part of me thought maybe no one would ever find it. The tree was old, the ground undisturbed for decades. What were the chances?" "My dog," I said flatly. "My dog found it in 3 weeks. All those years you thought you were safe, and it took a German Shepherd mix less than a month to undo everything." Lawson stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if accepting some cosmic justice in the irony. "Animals know," he said quietly. "They sense things humans miss. Your dog knew something was wrong with that ground. He was trying to tell you." I didn't come here for philosophy, I said, fighting to keep my anger contained. Tell me about Heather Monroe. Tell me why you killed her. His eyes drifted to the window where weak morning light filtered through institutional blinds. He was silent for so long that I thought he might refuse to answer. Then he began speaking, his voice barely above a whisper, each word seeming to cost him physical effort. I worked at Mountain View Hospital in maintenance. Night shift mostly. Heather was a nurse there. She was kind to everyone, always smiling, always had a good word even for people like me who were invisible to most of the staff. He paused, swallowing with difficulty. I developed feelings for her. Unhealthy feelings. I started watching her, learning her routines, taking photographs. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just admiring her from a distance. The surveillance photos we'd found. The careful documentation of her daily life. My stomach churned as Lawson continued his confession. One night in August, I followed her when her shift ended. She went to Riverside Community Center for an exercise class. I waited in the parking lot. When she came out, I approached her. I'd worked up the courage to ask her on a date. His voice cracked slightly. She turned me down gently. She was kind about it, said she was seeing someone, thanked me for the compliment. She didn't laugh at me or make me feel small. She was decent. Then why, I demanded, unable to contain myself. If she was kind to you, if she let you down gently, why did you kill her? Lawson's hands trembled on the thin hospital blanket. Because I couldn't accept it. In my mind, I'd built up this entire relationship, this future we'd have together. When she said no, when reality didn't match what I'd imagined, something broke. I grabbed her. She tried to scream. I panicked. My hands were around her throat before I fully understood what I was doing. The clinical detachment in his voice made the horror worse somehow. He was describing murder as if it were an unfortunate accident, a moment of lost control rather than a deliberate choice to end another person's life. I was renting a house on Willowbrook Lane at the time, Lawson continued. The Harrisons owned it, but they'd moved to a retirement home. I carried Heather's body to my car. No one saw. It was late, the parking lot was empty. I drove her to the house and buried her that same night under the oak tree. The ground was soft there, easy to dig. I worked until dawn, and then I went to my regular shift at the hospital like nothing had happened. How could you do that? I asked, my voice shaking. How could you bury someone and then just continue living your life? I don't know, he admitted, and for the first time I heard genuine anguish in his tone. I expected to be caught immediately. Every day I waited for the police to knock on my door. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months. They searched everywhere except that backyard. Eventually I started to believe I'd gotten away with it. But you kept the box, Pierce interjected, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the room. You kept photographs, newspaper clippings, her personal items. Why? Lawson's gaze shifted to the detective. I wish I could explain it in a way that makes sense. Part of it was fear. If I tried to dispose of the evidence, I might get caught. But part of it was something darker. Those items were proof that she'd existed, that our interaction had been real. I buried the box near where I'd buried her, like a twisted time capsule. You're sick, I said flatly. You were sick then and you're sick now. Do you have any idea what you took from her family? Her father spent 20 years holding vigils, hoping she'd come home. Her mother died without knowing what happened to her daughter. You stole Heather's future and you destroyed her family's peace. I know, Lawson whispered. That's why I confessed. Not because I suddenly grew a conscience, but because I'm dying anyway and I didn't want her family to spend another decade wondering. They deserve to bury their daughter. They deserve to know the truth, even if the truth is ugly. The truth being that you're a murderer who got to live a free life for 30 years while Heather rotted in the ground, I shot back. You got to rent houses and buy property and work jobs and presumably have relationships while she stayed buried under that tree. You don't get credit for confessing when you're already dying. That's not redemption. That's just you trying to feel better about yourself in your final days. Lawson flinched at my words but didn't argue. He looked at Pierce instead. Have you told her the rest? He asked quietly. Pierce's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That's not relevant to Mrs. Hayes. What rest? I demanded, looking between them. What aren't you telling me? Lawson coughed again, more violently this time. A nurse appeared in the doorway, checking monitors and adjusting his fore. When she left, Lawson spoke again, his voice weaker than before. The tenant before me, he said. There was someone else who rented that house in the early 90s. The Harrisons didn't do background checks, didn't ask many questions. They just wanted someone to pay rent and maintain the property. I don't understand what this has to do with anything, I said, but my heart had begun racing with a premonition I couldn't name. The person who rented before me buried something too, Lawson continued. I found it by accident when I was digging Heather's grave. I hit something solid about 5 feet down. A metal container, similar to the one you found but older. I opened it. His eyes closed briefly. There were remains inside. Small bones. A child's clothing. Photographs of a little girl. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Pierce's hand steadied me as the implications crashed over me like a wave. There had been another victim before Heather. Another body buried in that same yard. Another family somewhere still searching for answers. Did you report it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Lawson shook his head. I was in the process of burying a body myself. Reporting what I'd found would have brought police attention I couldn't afford. So I dug deeper and buried both containers together. Heather on top, the child below. Then I filled in the hole and planted flowers over the site. You buried a child, I said, my voice hollow. You found evidence that someone had murdered a child and you just covered it back up. I made many wrong choices that night, Lawson said. That was perhaps the worst of them. I've lived with that knowledge for 3 decades. That's why I asked Detective Pierce to excavate the entire area under the tree. There's more down there than just Heather. You need to dig deeper. Pierce was already on his phone, texting rapidly. His jaw was set in a hard line, and I could see barely controlled fury in his eyes. We'll find whatever is there, he said to Lawson. And we'll identify that child and notify their family. But don't expect gratitude for finally doing the right thing when you're too sick to face real consequences. I wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand how a human being could make the choices Lawson had made, but suddenly I couldn't stand to be in that room another second. The air felt contaminated by his presence, by the casual way he described burying not 1 but 2 victims in the yard that was now mine. I need to leave, I said abruptly, turning toward the door. Pierce nodded, following me out. Lawson called after us, his voice desperate. Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm truly sorry for what I've done to you and your husband, for the position I've put you in. I paused in the doorway but didn't turn around. Your apology means nothing to me, I said. The only thing that matters now is that Heather gets justice and that child gets identified so their family can finally know the truth. You're just a dying man trying to clear his conscience. I won't give you that peace. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall and tried to steady my breathing. Pierce stood nearby, giving me space but remaining close in case I needed support. The officer who'd been guarding the door had disappeared, presumably to give us privacy. There's a second victim, I said, still trying to process what Lawson had revealed. A child. How long has your department known about this? Since yesterday, Pierce admitted. Lawson told us about it during his initial confession. We were waiting for forensic confirmation before making it public. I didn't tell you before the meeting because I wasn't certain how much detail Lawson would share or whether he'd recant parts of his story. I apologize for keeping you in the dark. I shook my head, trying to organize my thoughts. Who was the child? Do you have any leads? We're checking missing persons reports from the late 80s and early 90s. The property was rented by several different tenants during that period. We're tracking them all down, interviewing them, building a timeline. Pierce's expression was grim. This has become a much larger investigation than we initially anticipated. Your property may have been used as a burial site by multiple perpetrators over the course of years. The thought made me physically ill. Multiple killers, multiple victims, all connected by one piece of property on Willowbrook Lane. The house Daniel and I had bought as a symbol of our fresh start had a history darker than anything I could have imagined. We need to go back, I said. We need to excavate the entire yard. Every inch of it. If there are more victims, more families waiting for answers, we have to find them. Pierce nodded. I've already authorized an expanded search. Teams will be back at your property by Monday. He paused, studying my face. Are you okay to drive back to Pinehurst, or do you need time to process this? I need to get home, I said. I need to see Daniel and Max and try to figure out what our lives look like now. The drive back to Pinehurst was mostly silent. Pierce respected my need for quiet, occasionally offering water or asking if I wanted to stop for food. I declined everything, staring out the window as the landscape blurred past. My mind kept returning to that hospital room, to Lawson's casual confession of not one but two buried victims. How many more might be out there? How deep would they have to dig before they were certain they'd found everyone? We arrived in Pinehurst just after 3 in the afternoon. Pierce dropped me at the house where Daniel was waiting on the front porch. He took one look at my face and pulled me into his arms without asking questions. I stood there in his embrace, feeling the solid reality of him, grounding myself in the present moment. There's more, I finally said, pulling back to look at him. There's another victim. A child. Buried deeper than Heather. And maybe more beyond that. Daniel's face went pale as I recounted what Lawson had told us. By the time I finished, he was gripping the porch railing so hard his knuckles had gone white. We can't stay here, he said flatly. Victoria, I know you want to tough this out, to not let what happened dictate our choices, but this is too much. Our yard is a mass grave. How are we supposed to live with that knowledge? I don't know, I admitted. But running away won't change what happened here. Those victims need to be found and identified. Their families need closure. If we sell and move, someone else will buy this property and inherit this nightmare. At least we know what we're dealing with. At least we can be part of making sure justice is served. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with conflicting impulses. Finally, he nodded slowly. Okay. We'll stay. But we're getting counseling. Both of us. This kind of trauma doesn't just disappear because we decide to be strong. We need professional help to process it. He was right, and I agreed immediately. The weight of what we discovered, the knowledge we now carried about our property's history, was too heavy to bear alone. We would need support, both professional and personal, to navigate whatever came next. That evening, Catherine and George came over with dinner. They'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that I'd traveled to Idaho to meet with Lawson, and they wanted to check on us. We sat around the kitchen table, the same table where we'd first opened that terrible box, and I told them everything. About Lawson's confession, about the second victim, about the expanded excavation that would begin on Monday. Catherine wept openly as I described the child's remains, thinking of all the parents in Pinehurst who'd lost children over the years to accidents and illness and the random cruelties of life. George put his arm around her shoulders, his own expression haunted. To think this was happening right here on Willowbrook Lane all those years ago, he said. We were raising our kids just down the street, never knowing there were monsters living among us. The weekend passed in a strange limbo. The funeral for Heather Monroe was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Riverside Community Church. Daniel and I debated attending right up until the morning of the service. Finally, I insisted we go. Robert Monroe had specifically asked to meet us, to thank us for our role in bringing his daughter home. It felt wrong to deny him that closure, regardless of how uncomfortable it made us. The church was packed. Every pew filled with mourners, standing room only at the back where latecomers crowded together. The media presence was intense despite police efforts to keep them at a respectful distance. Camera crews lined the street, reporters doing live shots about the tragic conclusion to a case that had haunted Pinehurst for 3 decades. Daniel and I slipped into a pew near the back, trying to be inconspicuous. But word spread quickly that we were there. I felt eyes on us throughout the service, heard whispers ripple through the crowd. Some glances were sympathetic, others curious, a few openly hostile, as if our discovery of Heather's body somehow made us complicit in her death. The service itself was beautiful and heartbreaking. Heather's friends spoke about her kindness, her dedication to nursing, her dreams of traveling the world. Photographs displayed on screens showed a vibrant young woman full of life and promise. Robert Monroe gave a brief eulogy, his voice breaking as he thanked everyone who'd never stopped searching for his daughter. He mentioned Daniel and me directly, expressing gratitude for our decision to call police rather than simply reburying what we'd found. After the service, as people filed out into the autumn sunlight, Robert Monroe approached us. He was smaller than he'd appeared on television, stooped with age and grief. But his eyes were clear and his handshake firm when he reached for Daniel's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for giving me the chance to finally lay my baby girl to rest." "I'm so sorry for your loss," I managed, my throat tight with emotion. "I wish we could have done more." "You did everything that mattered," Robert said. "You found her. You brought her home. For 30 years I've prayed for this moment, even while dreading it. Now I know." The not knowing was worse than any truth could be. We spoke for a few more minutes, Robert sharing memories of Heather as a child, her love of animals and her determination to help people. I listened and nodded and tried not to think about the other victims still waiting to be identified, the other family still trapped in the agony of not knowing. As we were leaving the church, Detective Pierce intercepted us. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Privately. There's been a development." We followed him to his unmarked car, parked a block away from the church to avoid media attention. Once inside with the doors closed, Pierce turned to face us from the driver's seat. "We've identified the child," he said without preamble. Her name was Sophie Brennan. She was 6 years old when she disappeared in 1991. Her mother reported her missing, claimed the father had taken her during a custody dispute. The father was investigated but never charged. He died in 2003. The mother passed away last year. "So there's no one left," Daniel said. "No family to notify." Pierce's expression was carefully neutral. "There's an aunt. Sophie's mother's sister. She lives in Seattle and has been notified. She's coming to Pinehurst next week to meet with us and discuss arrangements for Sophie's burial." "Is she?" I started, then had to clear my throat and try again. "Is she angry? About the property, about us living there?" Pierce considered the question carefully. "She's grieving. She's been grieving for 33 years. But she specifically asked if she could meet you both. She wants to thank you, same as Robert Monroe did. She said her sister died believing Sophie was alive somewhere, that maybe she'd been taken to another state or country. She said knowing the truth, no matter how terrible, would have given her sister peace in her final years." We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing this information. 2 families. 2 victims. Decades of grief and unanswered questions finally coming to resolution because Max had been persistent enough to dig in the same spot for 3 weeks. "There's more," Pierce continued, and his tone made my stomach drop. "The expanded excavation begins Monday, as planned. But based on property records and interviews with former neighbors, we've identified 4 additional tenants who rented the house between 1988 and 1997. We're tracking all of them down, conducting interviews, checking for any connections to missing persons cases during the periods they lived there." "You think there might be more victims," I said, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. "I think we need to thoroughly investigate every possibility," Pierce replied. "Your property sits on nearly half an acre. The area under the oak tree is just one small section. We're bringing in ground-penetrating radar equipment to scan the entire yard. If there are any other anomalies, any signs of disturbed earth or buried objects, we'll find them." The implication hung heavy in the air between us. Our beautiful yard with its towering Douglas firs and potential for gardens and outdoor living space might be hiding more graves, more victims, more decades-old secrets. "How long will this take?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with strain. "The investigation, the excavation, all of it. When can we have our lives back?" Pierce's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "Weeks at minimum, possibly months. Every potential burial site needs to be carefully excavated and documented. Any remains we find need to be processed by forensics, identified through DNA or dental records, and matched to missing persons cases. This is going to be a long process, and I can't guarantee what we'll find at the end of it." "We can't live here during all of this," I said, finally accepting what I'd been resisting. "We need to find somewhere else to stay. Somewhere we can try to maintain some semblance of normal life while all of this unfolds." Pierce nodded as if he'd been expecting this. "I've already spoken with the department about temporary housing assistance. Given the circumstances, the town council has approved funding for you to stay at the Pinehurst Inn for up to 3 months while the investigation continues. It's not ideal, but it's something. 3 months in a hotel room." The prospect felt suffocating, but what choice did we have? Our home had become ground zero for a criminal investigation that kept expanding with each passing day. Daniel thanked Pierce quietly, and we made arrangements to pack what we'd need for an extended stay away from the house. That night, back in our bedroom for what might be the last time in months, I stood at the window looking out at the backyard. The oak tree was silhouetted against the moonlit sky, its branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful. Nothing about its appearance suggested the horrors buried beneath its roots. I wondered how many times Richard Lawson had stood at this same window, looking at that same tree, knowing what lay beneath. Had he felt guilt? Satisfaction? Fear? Or had he simply felt nothing at all? Daniel came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. "We're going to get through this," he said softly. "I don't know how yet, but we will." I leaned back against him, drawing strength from his presence. "I keep thinking about all the what-ifs. What if we'd chosen a different house? What if Max hadn't been so persistent? What if we just filled in the hole and ignored his digging? How different would our lives be right now?" "But we didn't choose differently," Daniel said. "And maybe that's how it was supposed to happen. Maybe we were meant to be the ones who found Heather and Sophie. Maybe this is bigger than us and our plans for a quiet life in a small town." His words resonated with something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. There was a strange sense of purpose in all of this chaos. We hadn't asked to become part of this story, but now that we had a responsibility to see it through. To make sure every victim was found and identified. To give every family the closure they'd been denied for so long. Monday morning arrived with overcast skies and a chill in the air that hinted at the coming winter. Daniel had already left for his first official day at Pinehurst High School, nervous about how the students and faculty would react to him after all the media coverage. I'd spent the weekend setting up a makeshift office in our hotel room, reaching out to clients and explaining that I'd be working remotely for the foreseeable future due to personal circumstances. The excavation team arrived at the house just after 8. I drove over despite knowing I probably shouldn't, drawn by a morbid need to witness what they might uncover. Pierce was already there, coordinating with forensic specialists and the ground-penetrating radar operators. He saw me standing at the edge of the property and walked over with a tired expression. "You don't have to be here for this," he said gently. "It could be hours before we find anything, if we find anything at all." "I need to know," I replied. "This is my property, my responsibility somehow. I can't just hide at the hotel and wait for updates." Pierce studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But if things get difficult, if we find something, you need to be prepared for that." I spent the morning watching technicians slowly grid out the yard, marking sections with stakes and bright orange string. The radar equipment looked like something from a science fiction film, wheeled slowly across the grass in careful patterns while operators studied screens displaying data I couldn't interpret. Every so often they'd stop, mark a location, and move on. By noon, they'd identified 3 areas of interest beyond the site under the oak tree. 2 were closer to the back fence, in what had once been a vegetable garden according to old property photos. The 3rd was near the eastern boundary, close to where a tool shed had stood decades ago before being torn down. Pierce pulled me aside as the team began preparing to excavate the first new site. "We're going to start with the location nearest the fence," he explained. "The radar signature suggests something metal buried about 4 feet down. Could be nothing, could be another container like the one you found. Either way, we need to check." The excavation process was painstakingly slow. Each layer of soil was carefully removed, sifted, and examined before moving deeper. I watched from a distance, my stomach in knots, as the hole gradually expanded and deepened. 2 hours into the work, one of the forensic specialists called out. They'd hit something solid. Pierce approached the excavation site, pulling on gloves and crouching at the edge to peer down into the hole. After a brief consultation with the team, he stood and walked back to where I waited. "It's another metal container," he confirmed. "Similar to the first one but smaller. We're going to bring it up and open it on site. You should probably step back." I didn't move. I'd come this far. I needed to see whatever they found. Pierce didn't argue, perhaps understanding that turning away now would be worse than witnessing the truth. They lifted the container carefully, setting it on a tarp spread across the grass. This one was more deteriorated than the first, rust eating through the metal in places where water had seeped in over the years. The latch was completely corroded, and they had to use bolt cutters to break it free. When they opened the lid, I heard someone on the forensics team swear softly. Inside were bones. Small bones, clearly belonging to a child. Scraps of decayed clothing. A single shoe, small and pink with faded cartoon characters on the side. And photographs, protected by plastic sheeting just like in the first container. Surveillance photos of a young girl with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile. Pierce stood, his face grim, and pulled out his phone. "We need to cross-reference this with missing children cases from the late 80s and early 90s. He looked at me directly. "You should go back to the hotel, Victoria. This is going to take hours, and there's nothing you can do here." This time I listened. I'd seen enough. I drove back to the Pinehurst Inn in a daze, barely remembering the route. In our hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and called Daniel. He answered immediately, speaking in a hushed voice that suggested he was on a break between classes. "They found another one," I said without preamble. "Another child. They're still identifying the remains." Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, he asked, "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know how to process any of this. Our house, Daniel. Our beautiful house that we were going to make into a home. It's a cemetery. How many more are out there? How many more families are waiting for answers? We'll figure it out," he promised, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll get through this together. Just stay at the hotel. Don't go back to the property today. Let the police do their work." I agreed, though part of me wanted to return to the excavation site, to bear witness to whatever horrors emerged from our yard. Instead, I spent the afternoon working on client projects, trying to lose myself in the familiar routine of graphic design. Colors and layouts and typography were concrete things, controllable and rational. They offered temporary escape from the chaos consuming my life. Pierce called just before dinner. "We've identified the second child," he said. Her name was Lily Chen. She was 7 when she disappeared in 1989. Her parents reported her missing after she didn't come home from school. The case was investigated but never solved. Both parents are still alive and living in Portland. Another family about to receive devastating news. Another set of parents who'd spent 35 years hoping their daughter might still be alive somewhere, that maybe she'd been taken but was being cared for, that somehow she might still come home. Now they'd learn the truth. Their daughter had been murdered and buried in a stranger's backyard, her body hidden for more than 3 decades. The excavation continued throughout the week. They found nothing at the third site near the eastern boundary, just old concrete from the demolished tool shed foundation. But the second site near the back fence yielded another container. Another child. This one was identified as Marcus Jennings, 8 years old when he vanished in 1990 while riding his bicycle near Riverside Community Center. His mother had died years ago, but his father and 2 older siblings were notified. By Friday, the forensics team had completed their scan of the entire property. 4 victims total. Heather Monroe, Sophie Brennan, Lily Chen, and Marcus Jennings. 4 lives stolen, 4 families destroyed, all connected to one house on Willowbrook Lane. The investigation had expanded to examine every person who'd lived in or had access to the property between 1988 and 1997, a complex web of tenants, landlords, contractors, and visitors. Detective Pierce called a meeting with Daniel and me on Saturday morning. We met at the police station rather than our hotel, sitting in a conference room with coffee and pastries that no one touched. Pierce looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd been working around the clock. "We've made significant progress," he began, spreading files across the table. "We've identified and interviewed all but one of the tenants who lived at your property during the relevant time period. Most have solid alibis and no connection to the victims. But there's one individual we're particularly interested in. His name was Vincent Marsh. He rented the house from late 1988 through mid-1991, which overlaps with the disappearances of Sophie Brennan, Lily Chen, and Marcus Jennings." "What do you know about him?" Daniel asked, leaning forward to study the photograph Pierce had produced. The man in the picture was unremarkable, middle-aged with thinning hair and a bland expression. He could have been anyone's neighbor, anyone's co-worker. "Not enough," Pierce admitted. Marsh worked as a substitute teacher in the Pinehurst School District during that period. He had access to children, opportunity to observe potential victims, and knowledge of the area. After he left Pinehurst in 1991, his trail goes cold. No employment records, no tax returns, no Social Security claims. He essentially vanished. "Could he be dead?" I asked. "Possible," Pierce acknowledged. "But we're checking every angle. We've contacted law enforcement agencies nationwide, searched databases for similar unsolved cases, and reached out to school districts where he might have worked under different names." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "There's a possibility that what happened on your property wasn't isolated. Marsh may have committed similar crimes elsewhere." The implication sent chills down my spine. If Vincent Marsh had killed 3 children in Pinehurst, if he developed a pattern and methodology here, he might have continued that pattern wherever he went next. There could be other burial sites, other families still searching for answers, connected to this same predator. "What about Richard Lawson?" Daniel asked. "How does he fit into this timeline?" "Lawson rented the property from mid-1996 through early 1998, Pierce explained. He killed Heather Monroe in August 1997. He claims he discovered the children's remains while burying Heather and made the choice to cover them up rather than report them. We believe him based on the physical evidence. The children were buried deeper and earlier than Heather. The timeline supports Marsh as their killer and Lawson as Heather's. 2 different murderers," I said slowly, trying to process the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. 2 different killers who just happened to use the same property as a burial ground. "It's not as unusual as you might think," Pierce said grimly. "Certain locations develop reputations in criminal networks. Isolated properties, places with privacy and limited oversight. It's possible Marsh chose that location because the landlords were absent and neighbors weren't particularly watchful. Lawson may have been drawn to it for the same reasons, or he may have known about Marsh's crimes and saw an opportunity." Over the following weeks, the investigation consumed Pinehurst. Media attention intensified as details emerged about the multiple victims and potential connections to unsolved cases in other states. The FBI became involved, bringing resources and expertise to track Vincent Marsh across decades and state lines. Our house remained off-limits, still an active crime scene despite the excavation being complete. Daniel threw himself into his work at Pinehurst High School, finding purpose in teaching history to teenagers who were surprisingly thoughtful about the tragedy unfolding in their town. Several of his students created projects about the case, examining how communities respond to violence and how justice systems handle cold cases. He told me it helped him process everything, channeling the darkness into something educational and meaningful. I struggled more. Working from the hotel room felt isolating, and every client call required explaining why I was unavailable for in-person meetings. Catherine visited regularly, bringing home-cooked meals and conversation that carefully avoided discussing the investigation unless I brought it up first. She and George had become unexpected anchors, reminding us that Pinehurst contained good people and possibilities for genuine community despite the horrors that had occurred here. In late October, nearly 6 weeks after Max had first unearthed that terrible box, Detective Pierce called with news. "We've located Vincent Marsh," he said, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "He's been living in Montana under the name Vincent Marshall. Local authorities picked him up this morning on our warrant. He's being extradited to Oregon to face charges." The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. They'd found him. After decades of freedom, Vincent Marsh would finally face justice for what he'd done to Sophie, Lily, and Marcus. I asked Pierce if there was any indication Marsh had killed others, if their fears about a broader pattern had been confirmed. "Still investigating," Pierce replied. "But Montana authorities are conducting their own review of unsolved cases from the past 30 years. There are some disturbing similarities to cases in 3 different states where Marsh lived or worked. It's going to take time to build those connections, but we're cautiously optimistic about potential breaks in several cold cases." That evening, Daniel and I sat in our cramped hotel room and allowed ourselves to feel something approaching hope. The investigation wasn't over, but significant progress had been made. 4 families had received answers after decades of uncertainty. 2 killers had been identified, 1 dying and 1 captured. Our role in this terrible story was winding down, and we could begin considering what came next. The question of whether to keep the house dominated our conversations. The property had been released by the police, declared no longer needed for the investigation. Forensics had completed their work, taken their samples and photographs, and moved on to processing evidence and building cases. We could return whenever we wanted. But did we want to? I returned to the house alone one gray November afternoon. The yard looked worse than I'd imagined. Multiple excavation sites left gaping wounds in the grass. Equipment tracks had turned the lawn into a muddy mess. The area under the oak tree where Max had first started digging was a massive pit, carefully documented and photographed but still open to the elements. It would take months and significant money to restore any semblance of normalcy. But standing there in the damaged yard, I felt something unexpected. The property no longer frightened me. The secrets had been uncovered, the victims found and identified, the killers exposed. What remained was just land, just earth and trees and space. The house itself was still beautiful, still structurally sound, still full of potential. The horrors hadn't happened within its walls but beneath its soil, and that soil had now been thoroughly cleansed through investigation and exposure to sunlight. Max appeared at my side, having escaped from the car where I'd left him. He walked calmly to the pit under the oak tree and sat down, looking at me with intelligent eyes. His work was done. He'd found what needed to be found. Now he was ready to move forward. Daniel found me there an hour later, standing in the backyard with Max at my feet. He didn't say anything, just came up beside me and took my hand. We stood together in silence, watching clouds move across the gray sky. "I want to stay," I said finally. "I want to fix the yard and plant a memorial garden for the victims. I want to live here and build the life we planned. Not despite what happened, but in honor of the people who were stolen from their families. We can create something beautiful here. Something that transforms this place from a site of tragedy into a home filled with life and purpose." Daniel squeezed my hand. "Then that's what we'll do." The decision made, we threw ourselves into restoration and remembrance. We hired a landscaping company to fill the excavation sites and restore the yard. Where each victim had been found, we planted a tree. A dogwood for Heather Monroe, its white flowers a symbol of purity and remembrance. A cherry blossom for Sophie Brennan, delicate and beautiful. A Japanese maple for Lily Chen, its leaves turning brilliant red each autumn. And an oak sapling for Marcus Jennings, planted near its ancient parent, a promise of strength and endurance. We created a small memorial garden near the back fence, with a stone bench and plaques bearing the names of the 4 victims. We invited their families to visit whenever they wished, to sit in the garden and remember their loved ones. Robert Monroe came first, spending an entire afternoon sitting beneath Heather's dogwood tree, telling stories about his daughter to anyone who would listen. Lily Chen's parents visited from Portland, bringing flowers and photographs that they placed carefully at the base of her maple tree. The garden became something more than we'd intended. Other families began asking if they could add memorials for their own lost loved ones, children and adults who died or disappeared under tragic circumstances. We agreed, expanding the space to accommodate more plaques and plantings. What had started as a private attempt to honor 4 victims evolved into a community memorial, a place where Pinehurst could collectively process grief and loss. By spring, the yard had been transformed. New grass covered the scars left by excavation. The memorial garden flourished with carefully tended plants and flowers. The house itself had been painted, refreshed, made into something that felt truly ours. We'd turned tragedy into something meaningful, created beauty from ashes. Vincent Marsh was tried and convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming, built on forensic analysis, witness testimony from former neighbors who remembered his strange behavior around children, and ultimately his own confession extracted during interrogation. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Montana authorities filed additional charges connected to 2 more victims found in locations where Marsh had lived. He would die in prison, which felt like inadequate justice but the best the system could offer. Richard Lawson died in December, 3 months after his confession. His cancer had progressed rapidly, and he'd slipped into unconsciousness during his final week. He'd never stood trial for Heather's murder, never faced cross-examination or victim impact statements. But he had given the Monroe family closure, and for that I was grudgingly grateful despite my anger at his choices. Daniel's work at the high school flourished. His willingness to discuss difficult topics and his personal connection to the case made him popular with students who appreciated his honesty about trauma and justice. I'd built my graphic design business to a point where I needed to hire an assistant, a recent college graduate named Riley who'd moved to Pinehurst specifically because of how the community had responded to tragedy. Max remained our constant companion, aging gracefully and content now that his urgent purpose had been fulfilled. He spent his days lounging in the memorial garden, apparently at peace with the property he'd worked so hard to expose. Visitors to the garden often commented on his presence, calling him a hero dog, the one who'd started everything. He accepted the attention with calm dignity, as if he'd known all along that this was his role. 2 years after we'd first moved to Pinehurst, we hosted a dedication ceremony for the memorial garden. The families of all 4 victims attended, along with Detective Pierce, half the town, and media outlets covering the anniversary of the case's resolution. We'd commissioned a central monument, a granite sculpture of a tree with 4 sets of roots intertwining beneath the earth, representing the connected fates of the victims and the community's commitment to remembering them. Robert Monroe spoke briefly, his voice strong despite his age. "My daughter Heather was taken from us 30 years ago," he said to the assembled crowd. "For most of those years, we lived in agony, not knowing what had happened to her, unable to properly mourn or find closure. Victoria and Daniel Hayes gave us that closure by doing the right thing when they could have simply looked away. This garden, this memorial, ensures that Heather and the children buried alongside her will never be forgotten." Lily Chen's father spoke next, his words echoing similar themes of gratitude and remembrance. Then Sophie Brennan's aunt and Marcus Jennings' sister each shared memories, transforming the victims from abstract names in news reports back into real people with personalities and dreams and families who loved them. When it was my turn to speak, I felt Daniel's hand on the small of my back, supporting me as I stepped forward. I'd prepared remarks but found myself abandoning them in favor of speaking from the heart. 2 years ago, my husband and I moved to Pinehurst looking for a fresh start. What we found instead was a tragedy that had haunted this community for decades. We could have turned away from it, sold the property and moved somewhere without such painful history. But we chose to stay. We chose to honor the victims by creating something beautiful where terrible things had occurred. This garden represents transformation. It proves that darkness can be brought into light, that secrets can be exposed and dealt with, and that communities can heal when they face difficult truths together. As I spoke, I looked out at the faces gathered in our backyard. Neighbors who'd welcomed us despite the chaos we'd inadvertently brought to their street. Law enforcement officers who'd worked tirelessly to solve decades-old crimes. Family members who'd carried unbearable grief for years and could finally begin to heal. Students from Daniel's classes who'd come to understand that history isn't just something in textbooks but living memory that shapes communities. And Daniel beside me, my partner in all of this, who'd never wavered in his support even when staying seemed impossible. This garden is open to anyone who needs a place to remember, to grieve, to find peace, I continued. It belongs to this community now. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we have choices. We can choose compassion over indifference. We can choose to honor victims rather than forget them. We can choose to transform tragedy into something meaningful and beautiful. The ceremony concluded with the planting of one additional tree, a magnolia that would bloom each spring with flowers symbolizing dignity and perseverance. We planted it together, all the families and Daniel and me, each taking a turn with the shovel. Max supervised from his usual spot near the bench, and when we'd finished, he walked over to the newly planted tree and lay down beside it, as if giving his approval. That evening, after everyone had gone and the yard was quiet again, Daniel and I sat on the memorial bench watching the sun set through the trees. The dogwood, the cherry blossom, the maple, the oak sapling, and now the magnolia all stood as living testaments to lives lost and remembered. The garden we'd created had become something larger than ourselves, a gift to a community that had welcomed us despite everything. Do you ever regret it? Daniel asked quietly. Choosing to stay, to go through all of this. I considered the question honestly. The past 2 years had been the hardest of my life. The trauma of discovering the victims, the stress of the investigation, the constant media attention, and the emotional weight of carrying other people's grief had taken their toll. But through it all, we discovered something important about ourselves and about what truly mattered in life. No, I said finally. This wasn't the peaceful fresh start we'd imagined, but it was real and meaningful in ways we never could have anticipated. We made a difference. We gave families answers they'd been seeking for decades. We created something beautiful from something terrible. I wouldn't trade that for anything. Max shifted position near the magnolia tree, his contented sigh audible in the evening quiet. Daniel smiled and pulled me closer, and we sat together as darkness fell softly over our yard, over the memorial garden, over the life we'd built in Pinehurst against all odds and expectations. The future remained uncertain in many ways. We'd likely never fully escape the notoriety of what had been found on our property. The memorial garden would continue to draw visitors, some seeking genuine connection and others motivated by darker curiosities. The house on Willowbrook Lane would forever be associated with tragedy in local lore and true crime discussions. But it would also be known as the place where secrets were finally exposed, where justice was served, and where a community came together to honor the dead and support the living. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, I thought about all the choices that had led us to this moment. The decision to leave Seattle and seek a quieter life. The choice of this particular house on this particular street. Max's persistent digging that we could have stopped but chose to investigate instead. The decision to call police rather than rebury what we'd found. The choice to stay rather than flee. Each decision had been ours, but together they'd created something larger than individual choices, a pattern of responsibility and courage that had transformed tragedy into remembrance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.